Alrighty, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time of day you are choosing to watch this set of videos. So welcome back, in this case to week 13, as we are continuing on our conversation about water quality this time. So last week we discussed freshwater resources and water quantity, right? But in this week we're going to talk about water quality, specifically about water pollution, 7 types of water pollution that we have, and ways that we can then treat the water to make it safe for ecological dumping and also human consumption. So this is I think this is a really interesting topic, and I encourage you to dive a bit further and deeper into some of these ideas, especially on the local level, especially because water conservation and water quality and water quantity is a very important thing here in California, right? As you recall, we're a drought state. Currently, as spring of 2024, we are out of a drought. However, we know that we can very easily slip back into a drought or even an extreme drought or further, right? So these are always things that we need to keep in mind. So I hope that you enjoy this week's material. Starting with, so we are going to be in module 6.2, in this case, looking at water pollution. So your book does a really good job of looking at and focusing on the Gulf of Mexico and something called a dead zone. So we'll talk a little bit further exactly about what dead zones are in another video. But I think it's a very, very, very important topic. You know, I teach oceanography. I'm very in tune with the oceans. So something like this is actually very, very important to me because of the ecosystems that are involved. And also I'm from the state of Iowa, right? So there's consequences from what my family does as a living that has consequences down the line, thousands of miles away, hundreds of thousands of miles away in the Gulf of Mexico. So what is water pollution? There are 2 definitions here, and the top definition is the one from your book. So that means that there's an addition of any substance that might degrade the quality of the water. But I kind of like the second definition here, where it describes that in addition to water that threatens health, survival, or activities of humans or other living organisms. So I think the first definition kind of just talks about water in general, not necessarily like how we can then use or consume that water. And that's why I like this second definition a little bit better, because it weaves in this idea that we indeed have to consume it. So we're going to talk about 7 different types of water pollution. And these are ones that a colleague of mine has kind of situated out or listed out. It's not necessarily bullet points from your book, I suppose, but these are indeed ways that we can pollute the water. Starting with disease, disease-causing agents. So anything like microbial that could be in the water that could cause any sort of harm to either human consumption or anything that's in the water. There's plant and algae nutrients. So oftentimes this is actually too much nutrients. And then sediment pollution, organic compounds, inorganic chemicals, thermal pollution, which isn't one that we necessarily think of as being pollution perhaps, and radioactive substances. And one type of pollution that I would personally actually add on to this list that is not here, but it is a problem more so in the oceans, is noise pollution. And noise pollution is actually really detrimental to some of our larger creatures that use sound for communication, like whales and dolphins, and really any of the cetaceans that use sound to either hunt or to communicate with each other. So noise pollution can include cargo ships, cruise ships, military activities. Unfortunately, a lot of military activities include detonating bombs in the oceans, as well as submarines and sonar. stuff like that. So that's not necessarily on this list, but it is a type of pollution that is another one of those that's near and dear to my heart. So what I would want for you to do with each of these types of pollution would be to define exactly what it means, give specific examples, provide several important sources, indicate whether or not they are a point or a non-point source, and I'll explain what those are on the next slide, and then what can be done to decrease the impacts of this pollution. So the next video will actually go through pretty much each of these types of pollution and talk through them a bit further. So what is a point source versus a non-point source type of pollution? So a point source simply means that there's a single identifiable source for where that pollution came from. So in this case, here on the left-hand side from this infographic from your book, we can look at some industrial and agricultural sources discharge pollutants directly into a body of water. So we have sewage treatment plants that go directly into this particular river, or a feedlot and waste lagoon, or even industrial waste or heated water discharge. This last one here is very common in the fast fashion industry, in areas where they don't have quite as stringent laws like they do here in the United States, which is one of the reasons why they kind of outsource creating fast fashion textiles to other regions, because they don't have those restrictions. Whereas non-point sources, these are many diffuse sources. So they are much more difficult to pinpoint. They often involve things like runoff, like agricultural fields or roads. And again, it can be a variety of sources here. So things like open mines or croplands and animal pastures, construction sites, where things like when it rains, it can then go into the groundwater, which can then of course seep into the rivers, streams, or creeks. But again, it can be from like all around, and even sometimes be a mixture thereof, which is kind of a scary thing to consider. And lastly, before we get into the next video talking about the 7 different types of pollution, I want to review this idea of the watershed review. So this is going back to the concepts from last week when we learned about freshwater and what watershed means. Drawing where your like highest region would be. And if you recall, the closer you are to the divide will generally be your cleanest water, and then the further down the gradient you are, remember what that term gradient means, further down the gradient, the more likelihood you will have of potentially having more contaminants. But of course, and of course this varies from region to region, and area to area, country to country, even sometimes state to state, depending on the local laws that are there. So keeping all of these things in mind, in the next video, we'll look into the 7 different types of pollution as indicated per a previous colleague. So thank you for watching this little introduction about water pollution.